Hello, welcome to Mississippi in the Civil War. This is part two of touring Civil War Vicksburg. And I'm sorry it's taken me so long to get this second part out. I had planned to do it much quicker, but fate intervened in the form of a really nasty sinus infection. So for the past week, I've been hacking and coughing and been totally unable to film anything. So this is my first attempt at trying to do a video after more or less recovering after the use of some very powerful antibiotics. So bear with me if you happen to hear a little coughing or other unspeakable noises going on in the course of this video. I'm going to start the second part of this video right where we left off. We left off with the Warren County Courthouse, and that's where we're going to start. I have a real love for this building. I don't know if I mentioned it in the first part. I probably did, but I'll say it again. I was fortunate enough to work in this building as a historian for the Old Courthouse Museum for 9 years, and they were 9 of the best years of my life. I was able to dedicate myself to Vicksburg's history during that time, and it was just an amazing experience. I got to learn under Gordon Cotton, the director at the time, also under Blanche Terry, our second in charge, and they were just amazing people, and I learned so much from them. And just to get into it, this photo is fairly well known, but I believe it is often incorrectly described. You will often see it described as being Union soldiers and civilians mourning the death of Abraham Lincoln. But I don't think that's correct. I believe that if you take a look at the trees in the background, or you can see in the side, the foreground here, they look like it's winter. And I believe, and in fact, I'm pretty sure that this image is actually of a celebration for the re-election of Abraham Lincoln in November 1864. Such an event was held on the courthouse grounds after the election, and I even have found a copy of this photograph in a collection in Pennsylvania that belonged to a surgeon who was stationed in Vicksburg, and it is inscribed on the back saying that that's what the scene was, the celebration on the re-election of Abraham Lincoln, and that's what I believe this image is, and hopefully further research will be able to pinpoint this identification in concrete. Oops, wrong way. And my next image here, this is a picture I took a few years back, but this is the oldest veterans monument in the city of Vicksburg, the first Civil War monument. And this monument was put up on June 11th, or was dedicated June 11th, 1887 by the veterans of the 3rd Louisiana Infantry. It's on Monroe Street in Vicksburg, and the veterans of the 3rd Louisiana put up this monument in memory of their comrades who had fought in the siege of Vicksburg. And it was really appropriate that the 3rd Louisiana should do this because they were the unit that suffered the heaviest casualties of any Confederate unit during the siege of Vicksburg. They had 45 men killed and 126 wounded during the 47-day siege. And if you've never read it, there is an excellent regimental history of the 3rd Louisiana. It was written by William H. Tunnard. The title of it is A Southern Record. And if you go to Google Books, you can actually download a copy of it for free. But Tunnard wrote this immediately after the war. It was published in 1866, so the war was still very fresh in his memory when he wrote his regimental history, and it is very well done. And he gives a very moving account of the siege of Vicksburg, and it's well worth reading. I highly recommend it. And if you go down to the waterfront today, you'll see a number of historical markers reminding people of the naval history that goes along with the Civil War in Vicksburg. And one of the most dramatic scenes, I think, of the entire war occurred on July 15th, 1862, when the Confederate ironclad CSS Arkansas battled through the Union fleet on the Mississippi River to reach safety at Vicksburg. The vessel was badly damaged in the fight, but she did manage to reach the landing under her own power. Many citizens then rushed down to the waterfront to greet their local heroes, but many of the citizens then recoiled in horror when they saw all of the dead and wounded on board the Arkansas. And shown in the inset here is Commander Isaac N. Brown, who was the commander of the CSS Arkansas during its run through the Union fleet. And another very dramatic historic moment that had its beginning here at Vicksburg and is commemorated with a historical marker down on the waterfront is the story of the Sultana. And in the spring of 1865, when the war was just winding down, Vicksburg was used as a collection point for Union prisoners being released from Cahaba and Andersonville prisoner of war camps. The men were sent to Vicksburg by rail, and these former prisoners were placed on steamboats to begin their journey home. On April 24th, 1865, the steamboat Sultana was packed with more than 2,000 soldiers and a few civilians, even though she was only licensed to carry 356 passengers and crew. And unfortunately, the ship's boilers exploded just north of Memphis, Tennessee, killing approximately 1,800 people, making it one of the worst maritime disasters in United States history. And this is another image of Vicksburg taken during the war. This was taken from the top of the Warren County Courthouse, looking off to the southwest. And one of the most prominent buildings in this image is St. Paul Catholic Church, and it was built in 1849, and Mass was held in the building on a regular basis during the siege of Vicksburg. Because it was so prominent on the Vicksburg skyline, it did attract a fair amount of artillery fire, and it was struck on a number of occasions. On June 30th, 1863, the Vicksburg Daily Citizen noted that Mike Donovan, an old respected citizen of this place, had his arm frightfully lacerated by a shell which exploded in front of the Catholic Church while the early service of the day was progressing. A shell also entered and exploded in the sacred edifice, but miraculously injured no one. And the church survived the siege intact and remained the Catholic Church in Vicksburg until 1953, when a very bad tornado hit the city. The downtown area was devastated by that tornado, and the Catholic Church, unfortunately, was so badly damaged that it was deemed irreparable, and it was torn down, and a new Catholic Church was put up in its place. One of the main commercial thoroughfares in Vicksburg during the Civil War was Washington Street, and this image was taken looking down Washington Street right at the corner of Clay during the Civil War, and this was one of the busiest business areas of the city. And you can see in this picture, this intersection known as Tillman's Corner was named after William Tillman, whose saddle shop was on the second floor of the large three-story structure you can see in the picture. And up on the third floor was the Washington Gallery, where one of the many photography establishments that operated in the city during the war. And you'll see a lot of Civil War photographs, particularly CDVs, that are backmarked Washington Gallery, Vicksburg, Mississippi. And Vicksburg was probably, or not probably, it was the leading industrial city in the state at the beginning of the war. And one of the largest manufacturing centers in Vicksburg was A.B. Redding's Foundry. And it produced before the war items such as steam engines, boilers, piping for water and natural gas, steam gauges, parts for sawmills, you name it, they built it. The business employed about 100 people, 28 of whom were African-American slaves that belonged to the business. By 1860, Reading had built the foundry into the largest ironworking facility in the state. And shortly after Mississippi seceded from the Union, Reading offered to turn his foundry over to the Confederate government for the business of making cannon, and they did proceed to make a number of cannon for the government. The first guns were shipped out by the end of 1861, and between December of 1861 and April of 1862, Reading's foundry cast 45 cannon for the Confederate government. All of these cannon were made out of bronze. 29 of them were 6-pounder smoothbores, 14 were rifled cannon, and 2 were 12-pounder howitzers. And there's not very many of these guns still surviving today. There are a few, however, and there is one in Vicksburg. In the picture here is one of A.B. Reading's cannon on display in the visitor center at Vicksburg. If you ever get by there, it's well worth going to see. And I didn't mention, but the wartime picture was taken during the Union occupation of Vicksburg, and this was taken on the grounds of Reading's foundry, and it just shows the massive piles of shot and shell that the Union forces captured when they took over Vicksburg. They placed it all in Reading's foundry in the yard, and just left it there until they could figure out what to do with it. But there were just thousands and thousands of rounds that had been captured by the Confederates that were just stacked up in pyramids on the Reading foundry grounds. And another very distinctive building on the Vicksburg skyline was the Washington Hotel. And this picture on the right was taken about 1876. And the Washington Hotel, which was built in the 1850s, was a 3-story brick building with hotel rooms on the upper stories, and it had rental space for shops on the first floor and in the basement. The owner of the hotel was a man named Thomas McMakin. And McMakin owned the Washington Hotel, and he had a very well-known and well-regarded restaurant in the building. And McMakin was known throughout the state for his unusual way of letting guests know about his menu. He would walk around the dining room, and then he would shout the menu at a loud voice. One diner described his style as, quote, McMakin shouted, "Now then, here is a splendid goose. Ladies and gentlemen, don't neglect the goose and applesauce. Here's a piece of beef I can recommend. Upon my honor, you will never regret taking a slice of beef. Oyster pie, oyster pie. Never was a better oyster pie seen in Vicksburg. Run around, boys, and take orders." And McMakin was asked once why he came up with such an unusual way of getting his menu out to his patrons. And he explained that he had once owned a restaurant in Jackson, the state capital, and many of the state legislature members came to his restaurant, and there were so many of them that didn't know how to read, he resorted to shouting the menu so they would know what the specials of the day were. And during the siege of Vicksburg, the Washington Hotel was used as a hospital, and William Lovelace Foster, who was the chaplain of the 35th Mississippi Infantry, spent a good bit of time in the building ministering to the sick. And he wrote of the Washington Hotel, quote, "It was comparatively secure from those troublesome mortar shells, for most of them passed over, and it was too far from our lines to be disturbed by firing from that direction. Dr. Whitfield, with several assistants, attended to the invalids. All the rooms were soon crowded with the sick and dying, some in bunks and some upon the floor. Everything was conducted as well as possible, but oh, the horrors of a hospital." And then another building in Vicksburg that many Union prisoners came to know quite intimately was the Warren County Jail, which was across the street from the Warren County Courthouse. And you can see it in this picture taken circa 1864-65. Built prior to the Civil War, many Union soldiers were kept in here during the siege. One of them was Private Church H. Smith of the 46th Illinois Infantry. And he later wrote of his stay in the Warren County Jail, quote, "We found our new quarters as comfortable as we expected, although very unclean and filled with vermin. The jail was a good-sized two-story building, very strongly built and composed of brick. A small cookhouse of the same material filled one corner of the yard, and this important institution twice a day gave us a piece of cornbread and a small piece of India rubber beef. Boy, that sounds appetizing, doesn't it? And this is what's on the site today. The wartime jail was torn down in the early 1900s, and the current Warren County Jail built on the site. The only thing remaining from the original wartime jail is part of the back wall that went around the building is still there, and you can still see it if you walk past the jail. I wouldn't recommend walking up into there as it is an active jail, so the Warren County Police might not, or Warren County Sheriff might not be too happy if you did that. And another very prominent building that you would have seen if you were on the river during the war was the Marine Hospital at Vicksburg. Completed in 1856 by the United States government, the United States Marine Hospital was built to take care of passengers and crew of steamboats that got sick while coming up or down the river. And during the siege of the city, the Confederates used the Marine Hospital as a hospital and used it to treat their wounded. And then after the siege ended, Union occupation forces used it as a hospital as well. And during the siege, the Marine Hospital was located very close to the Marine Hospital Battery, and unfortunately a lot of the naval gunfire aimed at the Marine Hospital Battery actually hit the Marine Hospital. And Sergeant Edward S. Gregory, a member of the Confederate Signal Corps, wrote about the Marine Hospital. He said, "It was clear that the Federals did fire on the Marine Hospital, which was full of wounded men, and over which the yellow flag was hoisted. It was struck frequently, and wounded men wounded anew, but whether by aim or accident I do not know." And unfortunately, this very grand building was torn down in 1892, and there's only a state historical marker on the site marking where it once stood. And this is the aforementioned Marine Hospital Battery, and the CDB at the top there was taken right after the siege and shows that very powerful Confederate emplacement. And this was one of the strongest artillery batteries in the Vicksburg River defenses. The guns in this battery were in place so as to provide plunging fire against Union ironclads, so they could hit the unarmored tops of the ironclads. The battery was composed of 3 42-pounder smoothbores, 2 32-pounder smoothbores, and 2 32-pounder rifles. After May 22nd, it also contained a 7.44-inch Blakely rifle known as the Widow Blakely because it was the only Blakely rifle serving at Vicksburg. And the bottom picture shows the approximate site of the Marine Hospital Battery today. And unfortunately, there's really not much there to show you that it was in that position. I think there is one historical marker, but that's about it. And this is Cedar Hill Cemetery, and it was established in 1837 and is the largest burial ground in Vicksburg. And one of the most visited sections of the cemetery today is known as Soldiers' Rest, where the Confederate soldiers who died at Vicksburg during the war are buried. And on May 15, 1866, the ladies of Vicksburg founded the Vicksburg Confederate Cemetery Association and started work to make sure that all of the Confederates who had died in the Vicksburg vicinity during the war had a proper burial. And the exact number of Confederate soldiers buried at Soldiers' Rest is not known. It's believed to be about 5,000. Of that number, only about 1,600 have marked graves. And the monument shown in the photo was dedicated in 1893. They had a crowd of about 7,000 show up for the dedication ceremony, and Generals Stephen D. Lee and Robert Lowry gave speeches during the dedication. The siege of Vicksburg had a very profound effect on the residents of Vicksburg. both the soldiers who fought in the Confederate armies at Vicksburg and the civilians who had to live through the siege. And these are just a few stories concerning civilians during the siege of Vicksburg. And during the siege, women, children, and old men were all exposed to fire just like the soldiers were. And they didn't have the consolation of being able to fire back at their tormentors. And civilians were literally caught between a rock and a hard place. Union cells from the siege lines often skimmed over the Confederate works and slammed into the city from the east. You had the Union Navy firing into the city from the river from the west. And during the siege, you had probably about 2,000 civilians trapped in the city that were undergoing this bombardment. Fortunately, in the over a year that the city had been under fire, because the city had been under fire since the summer of 1862, and by the time of the siege of Vicksburg, the people had pretty much learned what to do when the city was shelled. They dug in, and they dug in deep. They dug caves to shelter in when the shelling got bad. And this knowledge quickly spread throughout the population, and very soon Vicksburg was honeycombed with underground shelters. And shown in the picture at left is a photo taken in the probably 1890s showing Tom Lewis, who was a little boy during the siege of Vicksburg, standing next to the cave that he and his family sheltered in during the siege of Vicksburg. And the caves did an excellent job of protecting the civilian populace of the city. There are no firm numbers, but the estimates are there are probably less than 20 civilians killed during the siege of Vicksburg, which is really amazing given how many thousands of shells were thrown into the city by the Union forces. And a correspondent from the Chicago Tribune entered Vicksburg right after the siege, and he reported in his newspaper, quote, "Along some of the main streets, which are nearly all flanked by precipitous bluffs, there is a cave every 10 or 12 feet. And fortunately, the soil of Vicksburg made digging caves very easy. Some of the shelters were just very simple affairs, big enough for a single family. Others were large enough for multiple families. Life in a cave could be rather unpleasant, as they could be very humid and dank. They were filled often with insects and sometimes even snakes. But they did their mission well. They protected the civilian populace during the bombardment. So they did what they needed to do. And one of the ironclads firing into Vicksburg during the siege was this boat shown here at the top, the USS Cincinnati. On May 27th, she tried to knock out one of the northernmost batteries in the Confederate river defenses, and guns such as the one shown here, a Brook rifle, roared to life, and they very quickly turned the Cincinnati into a flaming wreck. The Cincinnati drifted for a while and then sank, but after the siege was over, the Federals very quickly refloated her and put her back into service. That was actually the second time the Cincinnati had been refloated. She had sunk one time before. So the Union forces were very adept at putting these boats back into service. And one of the most well-known civilian homes in Vicksburg today is the Shirley House, and it was known at the time of the war as Wexford Lodge, and it is the only wartime structure still standing in the Vicksburg National Military Park. And in this image, you can very clearly see the effects of war on the Shirley House. The men of the 45th Illinois Infantry had dug into the side of the hill right in front of the house, and they even had an approach trench leading up towards the Confederate works, which are only a couple hundred yards away, going right through the front yard of the house. And the Shirley House was owned by James and Adeline Shirley, who purchased the house in January 1851. And at that time, it was described as a, quote, most desirable residence in a healthy location. By the summer of 1863, it was anything but a healthy location. Both James and Adeline were New England natives, although they had lived in Vicksburg for many years prior to the war. But they were pro-Union, and their views were not popular in Vicksburg. In fact, they were so unpopular that they sent their oldest son, Frederick, to Indiana when the war broke out because they were afraid that his outspoken support for Abraham Lincoln was going to get him in serious trouble. And when the siege began, Adeline refused to leave the home at first, despite the pleadings of the Confederate soldiers that were stationed nearby. And the Confederates had planned to burn the house because they didn't want it giving shelter to the Federals. But because Mrs. Shirley refused to leave, they were unable to do that. And she actually sheltered with her 15-year-old son Quincy and two African-American servants in the corner of the home by a chimney for several days before they were eventually able to talk sense into her and get her to evacuate with the family. And eventually the Shirleys took up residence at a plantation several miles outside of Vicksburg, except for Quincy, who 15 years old. He was a civilian, but he picked up a musket and joined the Federal troops who were fighting literally on his very doorstep. After the siege ended, Alice, who was shown in this image on the far left, actually met and married John Eaton, a federal officer who was general superintendent of freedmen for the Department of Tennessee. The couple married on September 29, 1864. And you may be thinking, boy, she looks way too young to be married, but this is a daguerreotype. This was taken many years before the Civil War broke out. This was probably taken late 1840s, early 1850s. So she was a good bit older when she got married in 1864. And then another very prominent home in the Vicksburg area was the home of Vicksburg's and Warren County's most famous son, Jefferson Davis, who lived with his wife Verena at his plantation home Briarfield, south of Vicksburg. After being notified of his election to be provisional president of the Confederacy in 1861, he left his home and traveled to Vicksburg, where he would board a train that was going to take him to Montgomery, Alabama. And on February 11, 1861, Davis boarded the train to begin his journey. And before he left, he made a very brief impromptu address. And Davis told the people of Vicksburg that he had worked to maintain, quote, the constitutional equality of all states. We have failed. You and I have resolved that our safety and honor required us to dissolve our connection with the United States. And shown in this picture is Davis's home, Briarfield. This image was probably taken on July 4th, 1864, when the Union occupation forces held a July 4th celebration at Briarfield. And of course, they placed, tongue-in-cheek, a sign up on the front of the house saying, "The house that Jeff built." And according to the newspaper accounts, there was also a sign over the back door stating, "Exit Traitor." And the newspaper also was quoted as saying, quote, "The Jeff place is also a very fine plantation. The residence has not been injured except the door locks and one or two marble mantles broken up, apparently for trophies. The Jeff furniture has been removed, but the rooms are still furnished with furniture brought here." That's from the Vicksburg Daily Herald, July 6, 1864. And after the fall of Vicksburg, Union occupation forces used Davis Bend, where Briarfield was located, as a refuge for the many newly freed African Americans who flocked to Vicksburg. And stationed to protect them at Davis Island was the 64th United States Colored Infantry. And this is a photo taken at Davis Bend of some of the 64th U.S. With their equipment stacked and their cabins that they lived in the picture. I think this is a really cool image, and it's one of my favorites. And my last photo is again a picture of the old courthouse with some Union soldiers sitting out front. And when the siege of Vicksburg ended, Dora Miller, who was a Unionist in sentiment, wrote, "Now I feel once more at home in my own country. But I think probably more typical was the reaction of Alice Shannon, very much pro-Confederate, who once wrote her sister that she could see, quote, that hateful flag flying from Courthouse Hill. And this ends part 2 of touring Civil War Vicksburg. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Please, if you would, like this video if you did enjoy it, and I'll try and get some more content out very shortly. But thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it.